Good morning. I am Jamin Dick from J Dick Advisory, where we help brands and retailers accelerate their supply chains and compete in the world of fast fashion. Today, I want to talk about what's coming up in 2 days, namely the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump. And specifically, I want to talk about how the Trump trade war 2.0 will affect retailers, and then how do we prepare for it? So let's jump into that. So in 2 days, President Trump will be our new president. And since the election, President Trump has been very clear about his intention to impose significant tariffs on all imports. And the question is, what will that look like specifically? And what does that mean for retailers and consumers? And then most importantly, what can we do about it to get ready? So let's start with what he has said. So there have been a lot of conflicting statements over the past couple of months, and things like 40% trade tariffs on China, but then sometimes he said 60%. He's also mentioned 10% universal tariffs, but he's also mentioned 20%. He's mentioned 25% on autos, and then subsequent to that, 100% on autos, and then many other statements. And I think part of that is just intentional, keeping it vague until we're at the negotiating table with other countries. But there are two things that seem pretty certain. And number one, he intends to make this a day one priority. So I expect that to happen. Number two, these are tariffs that will be significant. Before we go further, let's talk about how tariffs work. And there's a lot of talk about whether tariffs work at all or not. And one of the arguments against them is that the amount of money raised by duty collection is really immaterial to our economy and is largely passed on to consumers as cost. And this is true on both counts. The last round of tariffs from Trump's first term generated about $71 billion, which was roughly double what it was before the new tariffs took effect. And while that might sound like a large number, it's only 1.4% of the total U.S. annual revenue, which was $5 trillion in 2024. And more importantly, consumers paid for most of that, so it's not really borne by the origin country. But tariffs don't work because of the duties charged at the border. They work because of the dollars that are no longer flowing from U.S. companies to foreign companies. And this is the number that is a lot more persuasive if you're somebody like Mexico or China or Canada. For instance, the threatened 60% tariffs on China could easily divert more than $100 billion, maybe even $150 billion of revenue away from China from an economy that's already struggling with excess capacity. And in Mexico, whose GDP is 1/17, 1/18 the size of China's, the impact would be absolutely devastating. So that's kind of the background of why Trump is pushing these tariffs, especially with our biggest trading partners. In the past, so the question I think now is, will this be right away or when will it take effect? And in the past, tariffs have been announced at one point and then phased in over the following year. And imposing tariffs on goods that are already in the supply chain only impacts American companies. So tariffs only have the desired effect when the purchase of foreign goods doesn't happen, and that's going to take more time. So it's unlikely that any tariff changes would take effect immediately, but what's more likely is that significant tariffs will be announced early in the Trump administration, and then maybe on day one, and then we'll hang over the negotiating table, sort of like the sword of Damocles, for the next year. So that's what we see coming. In the end, I think President Trump is a negotiator first. And he's almost certainly using tariffs as a point of leverage to accomplish the priorities that he ran on. And these include restoring our trade balance, to our trade relations, bringing manufacturing back into the U.S. and achieving border security. There's also a national security motivation in that so many critical commodities, which include things like medical supplies and other technologies that are made almost exclusively outside of the US. This was felt especially acutely during the pandemic. When we saw in the US, we ran into severe PPE shortages and other medical shortages. And more recently, we've faced shortages in many critical raw materials, including steel, aluminum, lumber, and materials for batteries, and minerals for batteries. And then there's immigration, which was arguably the top issue during the campaign for Trump. And severe tariffs are likely the fastest way to make Mexico care a lot more about the US border. So I think that's something that's going to be a big priority. The mere threat of a 100 to 200% duty rate on autos will put the brakes on production almost immediately. And probably more importantly, it's going to put a chilling effect on potentially all new investment in Mexico while we're negotiating. So that's kind of why these tariffs potentially work. But there's another side to it, and I just want to touch on that. The US can't make everything, and tariffs ultimately hurt all parties in the long term if they continue, especially if it escalates into a broader trade war. If that happens, the historic inflation of the past 4 years will be made even worse, something that President Trump and the Republicans desperately want to avoid. And of course, our trading partners know this and are not without their own cards to play. For instance, 88% of all pickup trucks brought into the US are made in Mexico. A protracted trade conflict with them would impact one of the most important sectors in the economy, which is cars. So it's a safe bet that we will see a game of high-stakes poker over the coming year, but it's very likely that Mexico will capitulate to Trump's demands first. So here's why. In 2024, Mexico surpassed China as our largest trading partner at $503 billion of annual imports into the US versus China's $435 billion. So that's a first for Mexico. And I think even more importantly than that, Mexico's trade with the US makes up a much higher share of Mexico's economy than China's exports to the US make up of their economy. So Mexico will need a deal to happen soon, no matter what. And I think that's the first domino to fall. China will be a lot tougher. The US, as I mentioned, makes up a much smaller portion of China's exports than Mexico or Canada. And China has more trading partners, essentially the rest of the world. In addition, China is the one country that can incredibly threaten the US with impactful retaliatory tariffs, especially in the area of agriculture, where China ranks as the American farmer's #1 buyer. So I don't expect China to sit by quietly while the US makes a deal with Mexico. The moment a North American trade deal is struck, China loses negotiating leverage with the US, and the dominoes start to fall with other trading partners. So look for lots of Chinese trade delegations in Mexico City over the coming months. In any case, I expect Trump Trade War 2.0 to stretch well beyond 2025 before we see a trade deal reached. In the meantime, we'll be feeling the pinch on imports for sure. How much of a pinch is going to depend on where the goods are coming from. If it's from China, it could be up to 60%, maybe more, but at least 10% for any goods without an existing free trade agreement. So what can we do to prepare for this? If you're an apparel retailer, you've most likely already taken some actions to move your production away from China. Unfortunately for some, it was out of China and into Mexico. Or wherever you are in your sourcing journey, Reducing dependence on China is clearly a top priority. But finding qualified vendors with sufficient capacity takes time. And finding mills and trim production to complement your apparel manufacturing locations can take even longer. So there's a lot of urgency to get started on this quickly. So my first area of focus would be Latin America. For many years, North American apparel companies have wanted to create their products in Latin America, but have struggled to find factories with capabilities that are beyond basic cotton knits. Those days are over. While definitely not at the scale of Chinese apparel manufacturing, LATAM is definitely developing quickly, and it's increasingly able to produce more complex products now than it was before, such as swim, denim, and synthetics. And in places like Peru, Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico, of course, you can find sophisticated farm to factory operations with high quality, long staple cotton that rivals the best fabrics in the world. But maybe the most important feature of Latin America is the resilience it provides to the supply chain. In the last few years, we've seen supply chain disruptions ranging from lack of chassis to move containers around, political unrest that shut down Bangladesh, the closure of the Suez Canal from Middle East conflicts, and of course, port strikes in the US that shut down both US coasts on different occasions. Companies that are bringing their products from Latin America, they were able to avoid all of these disruptions. In fact, with transit times of 10 to 20 days, getting goods from Latin America is sometimes 2 to 3 times faster than many origins in Southeast Asia. Another important tool at the apparel retailer's disposal is tariff engineering. I want to be very clear about the difference between tariff engineering, which is a legitimate business practice, and misclassification, which is illegal. The reality is that classification rules and practices change from time to time. And the way that you design, manufacture, and market your product will determine the duty rate that you're charged. The classic example of this is the chicken tax, which was not a tax on chickens at all, but on light-duty cargo trucks and vans coming out of Europe. I'll leave a link down in the description if you want to look into the chicken tax more. It's a crazy story. Several automakers were able to legally evade this 25% tariff by manufacturing and marketing their vehicles for consumers instead of for business. And in so doing, they moved their duty rate from 25% down to 2.5%. And apparel and footwear and other fashion categories also have opportunities for tariff engineering. But it needs to be done according to specific rules related to design, manufacturing, and marketing to be legal. But it is legal, and doing it correctly can save millions of dollars in duties. Speaking of overpaying duties, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention if you are not recovering duties for product that you imported and then subsequently exported, let's say to cross-border customers in Canada or the rest of the world, you're leaving money on the table. And this takes some time and effort to get set up, but once it's set up, it's actually relatively straightforward to claim the duty drawback payments from customs. And finally, probably the most obvious thing you can do to avoid this tariff war that's coming is produce your products in the US. Now, this is not realistic for many companies due to the huge differences in raw material and labor costs, but you don't have to do everything here. You just need to make the product the final assembly and manufacturing here. So raw materials can come from elsewhere. But even in apparel, there are an increasing number of companies that are starting with a US-oriented sourcing strategy for at least some of their products. Todd Shelton keeps a surprisingly huge list of such companies here, and I'll put a link down in the description. Some of my favorites are Allen Edmonds Shoes, Duluth Pack, my absolute favorite up in Duluth, Minnesota, Buck Mason, Red Wing down in Red Wing, Minnesota. Do they cost more than offshore made brands? Yes. But can it be done profitably? Absolutely. Well, after 25 years in retail supply chain, I've stopped referring to disruptions like trade wars, actual hot wars, port strikes, and pandemics as unprecedented. That kind of thinking always results in getting caught flat footed by the next unprecedented event, which seemed to happen every year. This year's version of that is Trump Trade War 2.0. And just like 1.0, it won't be easy, but US retailers and consumers will survive it, especially if they put some of these strategies into practice. With some adjustments and being a little more clever about how we build our supply chains, we might even come out the other side of it stronger than we were before. Thanks a lot. We'll talk soon.